It doesn't start with cruelty. It starts with charm, with warmth, with the kind of closeness that makes you feel seen in a way you've been waiting for your whole life. And that's what makes what comes next so difficult to comprehend. When the person who smiled at you, who once called you special, begins to hurt you, not by accident, not in passing, but in ways that feel impossibly precise, you're left staring into a contradiction so disorienting, it feels like madness. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this phenomenon well. She believed that the most dangerous expressions of the shadow don't come through rage or open hostility. They come masked in affection. Because the shadow, when denied and unacknowledged, doesn't disappear. It hides. It plays roles. And often, it chooses masks that disarm even the most intuitive among us. This is why the damage doesn't always feel like damage at first. A sarcastic remark framed as a joke, a cold silence justified as space, a private betrayal dismissed as a misunderstanding, all delivered with a tone that says you're overreacting. And when you finally react, when the ache becomes too loud to ignore, they act surprised, as if they have no idea what you're talking about. But von Franz taught that the psyche is not so innocent, especially not when it's close to you. When someone is intimately connected to your inner world, they learn how to access your soft spots, not to hold them, but to press them, deliberately. The shadow in this case doesn't just emerge, it strategizes. And when that shadow is projected onto you, the one being harmed, the roles are inverted. You become the aggressor for defending yourself. They become the victim for being called out. This isn't clumsiness. This isn't miscommunication. This is masked malice, the kind that slips in through the back door of your trust. And the most terrifying part, as von Franz noted, is that these acts of psychological violence are often carried out with a calm face, a kind voice, even a touch of pity. They didn't mean it, you tell yourself, but somewhere, deep in your body, you know they did, because the cuts are too clean, the timing too perfect, the words too tailored to your insecurities to be random. Von Franz warned us, when harm comes cloaked in innocence, the soul begins to fracture, not because of the pain, but because of the confusion. That's how the shadow works. It doesn't just want to hurt you. It wants you to believe the hurt was your fault. And that's how it hides. Behind a smile, behind a laugh, behind a carefully constructed illusion that says, I could never do that to you. But they did. They always know where to cut. Not because you told them your pain, but because they listened when you thought they cared. The words they use, the silences they choose, the moments they turn cold, none of it is random. The harm feels personal because it is. It's not a moment of weakness or a slip of the tongue. It's deliberate, precise, and that's what makes it so hard to forget. Marie-Louise von Franz spoke of unconscious malice as something far more dangerous than open cruelty. The shadow, she said, doesn't lash out blindly. It studies, it observes, and when the moment is right, it strikes, not in generalities, but in the exact place you're still trying to protect. The wound isn't accidental, it's intimate, tailored, and the more familiar the person is with your inner world, the sharper their weapon becomes. That's what separates intentional harm from momentary conflict. Anyone can say something unkind in anger, but when someone brings up your deepest insecurity in the calm of conversation, when they echo words you once used to describe your childhood pain, when they twist your vulnerability into ammunition, that is not carelessness. That is calculation. And the one doing it often doesn't scream or rage. They speak softly. They may even say it with a smile. But you feel the sting, sharp and surgical. Von Franz understood that the unconscious carries a kind of cruel intelligence. When left unchecked, the shadow doesn't just want to hurt. It wants to win. And winning means targeting the exact part of you that still believes in goodness. They don't call you worthless. They call you too sensitive. They don't say you're nothing. They remind you of how easily you've been abandoned. They use your trust as a map, then call it coincidence when the path leads straight to your breaking point. This is the calculated cut, and it's often dismissed, especially by outsiders, because it doesn't leave bruises anyone can see. It leaves confusion. It leaves shame. And worst of all, it leaves you wondering if maybe they didn't mean it. But von Franz taught that the precision of a wound reveals its intent. When the same spot is hit more than once, when the same fears are echoed in different tones across time, when the hurt always arrives exactly where it will echo longest. It's not a pattern, it's a strategy. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You begin to understand that some people don't stumble into cruelty. They plan for it, quietly, carefully, waiting until your guard is down, your heart is open, and your silence can be used against you. That's when they cut. And that's when you finally understand. It was never an accident. Betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from those who stood close enough to study you while pretending to hold you. The deepest cuts are never delivered at random. They come from the hands you once trusted, the eyes that once looked at you with affection, the voice that once called you safe. And that's why it breaks more than your heart. It fractures your sense of reality. Marie-Louise von Franz understood that the most intimate relationships carry the greatest psychological danger, not because intimacy is inherently unsafe, but because it grants access. When someone is close to you, they learn your emotional architecture. They learn what you hope for and what you fear. They see the scaffolding that holds you up when no one else does. And once they've seen it, they know exactly where to strike if they choose to. Most don't, but some do. And those are the betrayals that leave you doubting not just the person, but yourself. Von Franz described this as the privileged intimacy of the shadow. When someone's unconscious darkness remains unintegrated, it doesn't just express itself in projection, it becomes a weapon, one sharpened by familiarity. They know what you value: loyalty, truth, tenderness. And that is exactly what they break. Not by accident, not in a moment of weakness, but through careful violation. If your core fear is abandonment, they leave when you're most vulnerable. If your deepest value is honesty, they lie with calm conviction. If your dream is to be truly seen, they blur your reflection just enough to make you question whether you've ever been seen at all. The danger is that this attack doesn't come wrapped in violence. It comes through small betrayals, justifications, apologies wrapped in blame. And because they know you, they know exactly what words will keep you tethered. You're imagining it. I didn't mean it like that. You're reading too much into this. The words are soft, but the intention is cold. And the more you try to explain your pain, the more they twist it. Because they're not trying to understand you anymore. They're trying to undo you without being seen. Von Franz believed that betrayal at this level forces the self into confrontation, with illusion, with grief, with the loss of the story you told yourself about who they were. But in that confrontation is also awakening. The realization that if someone uses your heart as a blueprint for harm, it is not because you were too open. It's because they were too closed to meet you there. When the shadow knows you, it doesn't just want to hurt you. It wants to convince you that you caused it. Contempt is not loud. It doesn't announce itself with slurs or threats. It settles in quietly, like a layer of dust over everything that was once warm. The tone changes. The patience disappears. The eyes no longer see you. They scan you. You're still in the room, still speaking, still trying to reach them, but something essential has shifted. You're no longer being heard. You're being judged, weighed, reduced. Marie-Louise von Franz saw contempt as one of the most dangerous emotional thresholds in human relationships. Because once contempt enters the room, love has already been exiled. What follows is not conflict, it's cruelty. Cold, calculated, and clean. The kind of cruelty that doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like erasure. Contempt requires one thing to survive: dehumanization. To justify harming another person, especially someone once close, there must be a collapse in how the attacker perceives them. The more they resent your needs, your boundaries, your strength, the more they begin to see you as something less than human. An obstacle, a burden, an idea that must be corrected. Von Franz viewed this shift as a survival tactic of the ego, a defense strategy rooted in fear and fragility. When a person is unable to face their own darkness, when they refuse to acknowledge the envy, bitterness, or inadequacy rising from within, they project it outward. But projection alone isn't enough. The ego must build a case. It must justify its need to harm. And that case is built through contempt. You're no longer just wrong. You're selfish, dramatic, broken. Everything you do is interpreted through a lens that says you deserve what's coming. They don't feel guilt for hurting you. They feel entitled. They've rewritten the story in their mind. And now your suffering is not only acceptable, it's necessary. That's what makes contempt so lethal. It silences empathy. It distorts memory. It turns the person who once cared about your well-being into someone who feels morally licensed to destroy it. And the signs are almost always subtle at first. A joke that cuts too deep. An eye roll at your pain. A sneer instead of a sigh when you try to express something tender. You begin to feel foolish just for needing connection. And slowly, you start to shrink. Not because they've told you to, but because their contempt has already made you feel small. Von Franz knew that contempt doesn't always end in visible abuse. Sometimes it ends in silence, in a person erasing you while still pretending to be kind. But if you feel it, if your spirit begins to recoil around someone who once held you, trust that. Because contempt may hide its face, but it never hides its intent. It's not that they stopped loving you. It's that they've started resenting the parts of you that remind them who they aren't willing to become. No one wants to see themselves as cruel. Even those who hurt you often see themselves as justified, maybe even righteous. That's what makes the betrayal more confusing. They didn't just cause pain, they convinced themselves you deserved it. And they did it through a quiet performance, a kind of inner theater where they played the hero and cast you as the villain. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this need for internal storytelling. She believed that the psyche, especially when ruled by the shadow, constructs elaborate moral narratives to preserve the ego's image of itself. When someone chooses to hurt you, truly, intentionally, they can't face the raw truth of what they've done. So they rewrite it. They revise the memory, edit the context, and recast their role until they feel morally intact again. They'll say you provoked it, that you were too difficult, too cold, too dramatic, that they tried and you failed them. And somewhere along the way, that story hardens. It becomes the truth they tell themselves when guilt tries to whisper. It becomes the armor they wear when compassion tries to surface. Von Franz called this dynamic moral projection, when the guilt that should be felt inwardly is flung outward instead, landing on the person they harmed. So now, instead of feeling remorse, they feel justified. Your pain becomes their evidence. Your confusion becomes their proof. The more wounded you are, the more they point to it and say, "See, that's exactly what I was dealing with." And the story tightens its grip. Von Franz also spoke of archetypal guilt, a guilt so deep, so rooted in the psyche, that it becomes unbearable. Rather than feel it fully, the attacker builds a structure around it, a narrative strong enough to withstand reality. Because if they were to admit the truth, that they chose to wound you, that they aimed where it hurt, that they knew what they were doing, it would collapse the image they have of themselves. So instead, they elevate themselves. They make their betrayal look like a boundary. Their withdrawal becomes self-care. Their cruelty becomes honesty. They don't just explain what they did, they moralize it. And in doing so, they free themselves from responsibility, at least in their own mind. But the story doesn't have to make sense to you. It was never written for your healing. It was written to protect them from theirs. Von Franz believed that truth doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need applause. It simply is. So when someone builds a whole performance around their betrayal, pay attention. The louder the justification, the quieter the conscience. Because people who are truly at peace with themselves don't need to rewrite the past. Only those who know, deep down, that they crossed a line need to pretend it never happened. It doesn't start with a lie. It starts with a question. Are you sure that's how it happened? A raised eyebrow? A puzzled tone? A gentle suggestion that maybe your memory isn't as clear as you think. And in that moment, the ground beneath your experience begins to shift. Slowly, quietly, you start to doubt yourself, not because you were wrong, but because someone made your truth feel unstable. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this deeply. She called it reality inversion, a psychological process where the person who caused the harm recast themselves as the misunderstood victim, and you, the one in pain, become the unreliable narrator. It's not just about denial, it's about distortion, a ritual of rewriting what happened so thoroughly that even you begin to question whether your wounds are real. This is the heart of gaslighting. It's not loud or violent. It's subtle, intimate. The person says they never said what you heard, never did what you felt. They'll tell you it was a joke, that you're exaggerating, that you're too emotional. And the worst part? They say it with sincerity. They say it like they care. But it's not concern. It's strategy. Because if they can alter your perception of reality, they don't have to take responsibility for what they did. And if you start questioning yourself, they win twice. Once in harming you, and again in making you doubt your right to feel hurt. Von Franz saw this as one of the most insidious operations of the shadow, because it's not just about evading guilt, it's about taking ownership of your mind. They don't need to convince the world. They only need to convince you that you're overreacting, that your memory is broken, that your pain is misplaced. And over time, if you stay in it long enough, it works. You start apologizing for things you didn't do. You hesitate before telling your side of the story. You shrink, not because you've changed, but because you no longer trust the ground you're standing on. And that's exactly what they want, to replace your reality with theirs. But von Franz taught that the psyche knows. Even when the conscious mind is spinning in confusion, something deeper keeps the score. The body remembers. The soul remembers. The moments that felt off, the truth you swallowed to keep the peace, the ache that kept coming back. All of it is real. Gaslighting is not just manipulation. It is a psychic theft, an attempt to erase your clarity so you'll rely on theirs. But your memory is not broken. Your truth is not too much. And the moment you begin to reclaim your version of events, no matter how small, you begin to dissolve the spell. Because clarity doesn't need permission. It only needs to be remembered. They always come back. Not because they've changed, not because they've realized what they did, but because you did something they never expected. You healed. You stopped chasing, stopped explaining, stopped handing them the script they needed to keep control. And in that silence, something inside them stirs. Not regret, not remorse, but a craving, a hunger to re-enter the space they once dominated. Marie-Louise von Franz called this phenomenon psychic possession, a state in which the shadow takes control of the personality, seeking not growth, but repetition. The person who harmed you becomes tethered to a cycle of destruction, not because they're looking for connection, but because your peace unsettles them. Your boundaries expose their lack of them. Your recovery ruins their narrative. So they reappear, maybe with a text, a memory, a soft, "Hey, how have you been?" It sounds innocent, but it never is. The timing is too perfect, right when you're gaining strength, rebuilding your voice, starting to feel like yourself again. They show up not to witness your wholeness, but to fracture it, to remind you of the role you used to play, the appeaser, the forgiver, the one who bent so they didn't have to. They don't miss you. They miss the version of you who didn't know better, the one who apologized for asking for more, the one who doubted their instincts, the one who still believed their chaos was your responsibility. Von Franz believed that the shadow, once projected onto another, needs continual reinforcement to survive. When you remove yourself from that projection, when you reclaim your identity, your clarity, your life, you collapse the illusion they built around you. And in that collapse, they feel powerless. So they circle back, not to rebuild anything real, but to test whether they still have access. Their return is not reconciliation. It is a test, a ritual, a repeat of the very cycle that once broke you. And the most dangerous part? It often comes disguised as kindness, as nostalgia, as vulnerability. They might say they've been thinking about you, that they've grown, that they miss the connection. But pay attention, not to their words, but to what their presence does to your nervous system. Because if seeing their name floods you with dread, if hearing their voice shakes the peace you fought to earn, then you already know the truth. They haven't changed. They've just remembered the power they used to hold, and they want it back. But von Franz was clear. Healing breaks that spell. The moment you stand in your truth without flinching, their shadow loses its grip. Because you're no longer the wounded version they once fed on. You've become something else, someone they can't manipulate, and that terrifies them. Not all harm is equal. Some wounds are born from misunderstanding, from human error, from the chaos of emotions that come with being alive. But then there is the other kind, the harm that finds its mark too easily, the words that slice exactly where they're not supposed to, the timing that always seems cruel, not clumsy, the pain that repeats itself in patterns too precise to be accidental. That's when you're no longer dealing with a mistake. You're confronting intent. Marie-Louise von Franz believed that one of the most vital forms of self-protection is learning to see the difference. Shadow confrontation, she called it. The moment when you stop explaining away behavior and begin to look at it clearly without the blur of wishful thinking. When you stop asking, was that really about me? And start asking, how many times has this happened? Because intention hides not in the words themselves, but in the repetition, in the consistency of the harm. Someone who lashes out once in pain may still love you, but someone who continues to find your wounds, press them, and then blame you for bleeding, that is not a coincidence. That is emotional targeting. Von Franz saw this as a signature of the shadow's projection, a drive to control rather than connect. And the deeper the attacker knows you, the more accurately they strike. They remember the things you told them in moments of trust, the fears, the doubts, the stories that shaped you. Then one day those very things come back to you twisted, not in rage, but in cold precision. If your wound is abandonment, they vanish when you need them. If your shame is failure, they mock your dreams. And when you react, they act confused. Why are you being so sensitive? But sensitivity is not the issue. The issue is aim. Because people who hurt you unintentionally stumble. People who hurt you intentionally aim. This is how you recognize it, not by one word or one moment, but by the shape of the story, the patterns, the emotional blueprint that keeps getting followed, even when you try to shift the direction. And the longer you ignore it, the more it costs, not just your peace, but your perception. Because repeated harm disguised as confusion doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your reality. Von Franz urged us to look not only at what a person says, but what they do when you're at your most human. Do they step in closer, or do they pull the trigger? That is where intent lives, and what they do with your vulnerability. And once you recognize it, you can no longer unknow it. Because what looks like an accident once is pain. But what looks like it twice, 3 times, 4 times, that's a choice. There comes a moment when you stop trying to convince them, when you no longer explain your pain to someone committed to denying it, when you finally realize that understanding isn't the point, clarity is. That's when the shift happens, not in them, but in you. And it's the moment Marie-Louise von Franz believed marks the beginning of true healing, the conscious response. Von Franz taught that when the shadow is projected onto you, when you're blamed, diminished, or manipulated, the greatest danger isn't what they say or even what they do. It's what it pulls you into. The reaction, the unraveling, the endless defending of your truth. Because once they can control your response, they control your sense of self. But the conscious response is different. It doesn't fight fire with fire. It doesn't rush to retaliate or perform pain for proof. It pauses, it observes, it holds the full weight of the truth without needing it to be validated. It says, I see what this is, and I don't need to explain it to you in order to act on it. That's the difference. Not silence out of fear, but silence rooted in strength. Conscious response means reclaiming your right to define your own reality. It means refusing to let your boundaries be negotiated by someone who benefits from crossing them. It means walking away from the role they wrote for you, the weak one, the crazy one, the overreactor, and choosing instead to become who you were before their shadow tried to consume you. Von Franz believed that the ego wants drama, wants chaos, wants reaction. The shadow thrives on your spiraling. But when you don't give it that, when you meet distortion with grounded truth, manipulation with distance, cruelty with detachment, you starve it. Not with vengeance, but with indifference. And nothing enrages the shadow more than not being able to control what it once did. You don't need to yell to be powerful. You don't need to prove your worth in the aftermath of betrayal. Power is in the stillness that follows truth. The kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that doesn't chase, the kind that says, I know what happened, and I know who I am anyway. The conscious response isn't about winning the argument. It's about refusing to play the game. It's the choice to step out of the loop of reaction, of confusion, of pain, and into something quieter, but infinitely more solid, nyamis of self-respect. Because in the end, clarity doesn't always fix the relationship, but it will save you. There's a moment in healing that doesn't come with fireworks or closure. It comes quietly, after all the grief has been named and the silence has become familiar. You wake up one day and realize something that changes everything. It was never about you. Not really. You didn't cause their hatred. You didn't deserve the betrayal. You weren't too much, too needy, too dramatic. You were simply the mirror they didn't want to look into. And when you stopped shrinking to keep them comfortable, they mistook your growth for a threat. Marie-Louise von Franz believed that the self, the true inner being, is autonomous. It seeks wholeness, not permission. And sometimes the act of becoming yourself is enough to provoke the shadow in another. Because the closer you get to your own truth, the more clearly they see everything they've avoided in themselves. And rather than face it, they attack you. Not because you are the problem, but because you reflect the one they've buried inside themselves. They may have called you unstable when it was your intuition that made them uneasy. They may have said you were selfish when you finally set a boundary. They may have claimed you changed when what really changed was your willingness to stay silent. But von Franz reminded us, when someone hates the light you found, it's not because the light is wrong. It's because they're not ready to see you didn't fail the relationship. You outgrew the lie. You stopped apologizing for needing honesty, for asking for respect, for wanting something real. And when those needs exposed what the other person couldn't give or refused to, they chose to punish you for the discomfort they couldn't tolerate within themselves. So now you stand here, not without scars, but without illusions. Not because you wanted revenge, but because you chose truth. Not because you're hard or cold or unforgiving, but because you finally realized you cannot save someone by losing yourself. Von Franz would call this the return to the self, the quiet homecoming to who you were before you were convinced you were too much. It's not a grand triumph. It's a steady walk away from what hurts you toward what heals you. And that is more powerful than any revenge, because you no longer need them to understand, to admit, to change. You only need to remember, their hatred was never about your worth. It was about their fear, their shame, their refusal to evolve. And you chose to.